compiled into a theory, and those are sometimes really interesting articles. Again, a great way to make a contribution, point out the flaws in a theory, or you know, how it's contradictory. Now, more importantly, I think what making a theoretical contribution is not. So these are things that we often see people saying, oh, I've made a theoretical contribution. Well, I would list all these things as not making a theoretical contribution. So first of all, including a paragraph on a well-known theory and then ignoring that theory in the rest of your paper. I saw this a lot as an editor, and I see it a lot as a reader of research, where there'll be a paragraph on here's what resource-based view is, it's wonderful, and then you never hear anything about resource-based view again in the rest of the paper. That's not making a theoretical contribution. The second thing is a model, boxes and arrows, and I'll go into that some more here in just a minute, but just because you have a model doesn't mean you have theory. What about mathematical theory? That's one that I think is debatable. For empirical research, we would probably say no, but people who are modelers, that is the theory that they're looking at. So for that type of paper, that's appropriate as theory. So let's talk some more, excuse me, about theory and models. Theories aren't the same thing as models. They almost always incorporate a model. So a model is a way of showing a theory and making it understandable to the audience, but it's really a smaller component of theories. And you can put together a model that's totally atheoretical. So models don't always necessarily require a theoretical foundation. So a theory is larger than just a model, but often we show it as a model. So a model is a smaller optional subset of a theory. So it says, here's the independent variables that we're looking at. Here's the tests that we're going to perform. So you can see there's some boxes here that list the constructs, and there's hypotheses listed there. So it's a good way of portraying what you're going to do in a particular paper and how it reflects the theory. But by itself, it's not a theory. So models are certainly important in theory development. All right, so what I'd like to spend a lot of time on here is the building blocks of theory. So if you're going to build your own theory, how do you do it? What's important? And I want to preface this by saying this isn't the only way to make a theoretical contribution. Most of the research that I've done, I'm applying theories that other people have developed, and that is also a very valid way of making a theoretical contribution if you really incorporate it throughout the paper and use it in some of the ways that I just talked about. That's a little more easy to understand. So I'm going to focus primarily today on building theory. And there are 4 important building blocks of theory. First of all, constructs. Those are the what? You know, if you're looking at a theory and say, what is it that we're interested in? Those are the constructs. So the subject matter of a model. We usually show those by boxes if we're going to do a diagram. Second, how are those constructs related? Those are the arrows. So what are the relationships between them? And they show that one box explains another box. They don't show how it explains it, but that there's an explanation there. And sometimes you can infer that by looking at the model. Third is assumptions. What are the boundaries that frame the model? And often we forget about that. So conceptual assumptions would be your perspective. And we all come with our own implicit perspective. So how, you know, what's our perspective that is shaping the way that we see the model? And then also the context. Where does this model apply? Who does it apply to? Again, we often run into problems with that in supply chain, or at least I do. Pardon me, because I'm taking models that were developed in management, often for individuals, and then I'm trying to apply them to organizations that are linked in a supply chain. So I'm going beyond the contextual assumptions of the original theory. I think that's interesting, testing whether it applies organizations versus individuals, but it's important to acknowledge those assumptions. And then finally, so those are the dashed line there. That would be kind of the fence around your model. And then finally, propositions. This is where you really get into explaining what those arrows are. why does that relationship exist between X and Y? So if you can do all four of these things, then you're building a theory. So I'll talk about each of these and give some advice on how to do each of these too. So first of all, constructs. If you think of going to a play, the constructs are like the actors in a play. So what is really the content of this argument that you're trying to make theoretically? It's the central characters in the story. So who are the characters that are in the play? And you can see we've got two characters here. It looks like they have a relationship. I'm not sure why or how that relationship exists, but I could see they are singing or perhaps talking to each other, and they're holding each other's hands. So there's some kind of relationship between them. But the constructs would be the central characters. So tips for constructs. First of all, again, this is something I struggle with a lot when I'm using theory that was developed in a different area. It's really helpful to stick to the correct name of the construct. Sometimes I'm tempted to change it to something that's more meaningful in a supply chain context. But people who are reading the article, if they understand the theory from other areas, they really need to know what that theory is and what the original names of the constructs are. So try to stick with the original names as much as possible. You may have to modify them a little bit, like instead of saying trust, maybe call it supply chain trust. But people will still understand that you're going back to the original trust literature. Also, try to use really simple names for constructs, like one word is really good, a noun like trust, or maybe a 2 or 3 word noun phrase like supply chain trust. Keep them simple. It's fine to be creative when you're building a theory, but the creativity should come in when you're combining the constructs and looking at the relationships between them. Don't get creative in how you name them. It's very confusing to readers. They'll say, well, I read something that sounded just like this, but it had a different name someplace else. Reviewers don't like that also. So a few other tips for constructs. Just one box per construct. Don't try to use more than one box to express a single construct. Try to maintain a consistent level of specificity among the independent and dependent variables, and avoid mixing different kinds of constructs and levels of analysis. Sometimes you have to, but normally you don't want to have some team level variables and then higher level variables like organizational outcomes. So try to keep them on the same level and the same amount of specificity to the extent that you can. Again, depending on what the theory is, lots of times in supply chain management, we're looking at performance of a supply chain or an organization. So then because that's the kind of theory that we're looking at, that would suggest it is okay to have multiple levels, but try to avoid that to the extent possible. Also avoid really, really broad constructs that are very general because they're hard to test. And the best theory is one that's testable because it's going to guide the testing that you do later in the paper. A few more tips on constructs. Make sure that each box actually describes a variable. So a variable is something that varies. So can it take on values ranging from high to low? That makes it measurable and it makes it a variable. Also, make sure that each box represents something that is capable of acting or being acted upon. So it's a cause or it's an effect. So it causes your dependent variable or it is caused by your independent variable. Make sure you focus on the full range of the selected variables. Don't just limit them to just high or low, positive or negative. Unless they truly only have true values. Like if you're looking at gender, that only has 2 values, just male and female. But most variables, most constructs that we're looking at have a range of variables, much stronger theory if you're looking at the entire range and don't just say high and low. As you're developing a theory, once you've developed your focal construct, the one that, that is the basis for the story that you're telling, then you want to look for complementary combinations. So once you know what you're going to focus on, which constructs come before that and which constructs come after that. So if you're actually building a theory, just start out with one construct. It's much less intimidating. What is it that I'm really interested in? That's your focal construct. Really think about that. What's going on with that construct? Where does it come from? How is it named? And then what are some complementary constructs? What do you think comes before this? What comes after it? So again, the focal construct is the subject of your current scholarly interests. So if somebody says, Barb, what are you studying these days? I'll say social sustainability. That's my focal construct. That's what I'm interested in. That's the focus of what I'm doing. So how could you describe your current interests in like one word or two words? Complementary construct would be what combines with that focal construct to form a proposition. Well, what I'm really interested in is social sustainability in supply chains. So what sorts of factors, pardon me, would cause poor social sustainability? That would be a complementary construct. What is the impact of social sustainability on outcomes for a supply chain? That would also be, the outcomes would be a complementary construct. So if you start with one and then think about what comes before the construct and what comes after it, it's much easier than sitting down and saying, oh my gosh, I've got to draw a whole model here and I really don't know where to start. So one of the constructs that you're using should be the subject of the conversation that you're trying to have in the paper. So even though my broad interests are social sustainability, perhaps what I'm really interested in is modern slavery in a supply chain. Well, that would be an antecedent to social sustainability. So sometimes the antecedent construct is really what you're developing in the paper, but the focal construct is the broader issue. All right, so second is relationships, and those are the arrows in a map or in a model. And this picture, this is actually the plot. It was something I found online for people who are writing plays or books. So this is kind of a map for how to develop the plot. So arrows in the model, they signify a theoretical relationship. It's an explanation involving two or more constructs. But if you think about it in terms of a play, it's the storyline that connects the central figures. So again, the constructs are like the actors in a play, and then the storyline that connects them, that's the relationships or the arrows. So in a model, all boxes should be connected by arrows. So every arrow should signify a proposition that you can test. So there's different types of relationships. Direct relationship just links one construct or box to another without any intermediate links. And then indirect constructs or indirect relationships show a mediating relationship. And of course, there's moderating relationships as well. We won't even get into those, but each indirect relationship diminishes the observable effect of X on Y. You're saying X has a direct relationship with Z, Z has a direct relationship with Y, therefore X is indirectly related to Y. Each arrow in a model should signify an explanation. And a good piece of advice, I think, if you are drawing a model on a piece of paper with boxes and arrows, every time you put an arrow in, write an explanation above that arrow. Why did you put that arrow in? What does that arrow mean? Now, you're not going to do that in the paper that you publish. It's just going to be boxes and arrows. But it's really helpful to me when I'm trying to do this, if I write an explanation above every arrow and really think about why that arrow is there. So I'm not just saying statistically they should be related, but what does the theory tell me about why they should be related? So these relationships, again, you want to specify the type of relationship or type of explanation that you are proposing. So why your propositions are actually explanations. They're not just arrows. They're not just saying we expect to find this statistically. So X should lead to Y because, and just write that down on the model where you're developing it. Or X should lead to Y for the purpose of what? Or X explains Y because, or X explains, or Y explains X because. So, just jot down a sentence each time you do that. Again, really, really helps in tying your model to your theory. So the third building block is assumptions. And assumptions are like an owner's manual. I went out looking for owner's manuals online last night, and I thought this was a good one. So this is an owner's manual for a 12-inch bandsaw and sander. And I look at that, that looks like a dangerous piece of equipment. You know, if I don't use that the right way, I might cut my finger off, and I don't want to do that. Or if I plug it in and it starts raining and I'm using it outside, I might get electrocuted. So this is a dangerous piece of equipment. Assumptions for a theoretical model, it's like an owner's model, an owner's manual for your modules. So it gives you the terms governing safe use of your model. Where is it appropriate to use your model? Where is it not appropriate? Where might you end up cutting off your fingers or getting electrocuted if you use this model the wrong way? So it's a way of making your assumptions explicit. And again, really helps when you are actually drawing this out on a piece of paper to be very explicit about what your assumptions are, where this model will apply, where it doesn't apply, what are my perceptual biases that are shaping the development of this model. So making them explicit will help you write a much better paper. Now, we're looking at both conceptual and contextual assumptions. So context is a way of saying, what are the conditions under which the model holds? And they can then be incorporated into your propositions as predictors or moderators. And then conceptual assumptions are more the way you're looking at it, what's going on in your mind, what kind of mindset does this come from? They're both really important. So let's talk about both of them, starting out with conceptual assumptions. They represent a boundary of ideas. So I like this picture of a wall. You can see that beautiful forest is kind of enclosed in that wall. That's what a conceptual assumption is. So ideational boundary conditions. So based on your mindset, your ideas, what are the boundaries around the model? Reflects your perspective. What are your values that are guiding what you're looking at? What kind of a lens are you looking at the theory from? And the author and the reader really need to share that mindset in order for the propositions to make sense. And I come from a very specific, I tend to follow a very much a deductive kind of mindset. Sometimes I have a lot of issues reading inductive theory development. I mean, I can do it if I think about it, but I really need to tell myself, okay, this is a different mindset. It's not the way I'm used to looking at things. Kind of have to change gears to look at that. So again, it's really important to be explicit about where you're coming from. Contextual assumptions, on the other hand, there you're looking at context. So all knowledge comes from specific situations, or so it's local to some extent. Now, whether or not you acknowledge those limitations, they still exist. This is also important. Both types of assumptions, conceptual and contextual, are important to circle back to when you're talking about the limitations of your research and the discussion. Sometimes it's hard to come up with those, and I hate papers that say, well, it could be longitudinal. Well, maybe it shouldn't be. People just kind of throw that in because they don't know what else to write for the limitations. The limitations come from your assumptions. So go back to your conceptual assumptions, your contextual assumptions. They dictate what the limitations are. And then also look at how you studied something empirically, and that will also tell you what the limitations are. So it's very useful when you get to writing the discussion section. So contextual assumptions determine the scope of your explanation. Again, I was talking about mid-range theory in healthcare supply chain research. That applies very well in healthcare. Some of it may be only in hospitals, some may be for all of healthcare. Spell that out. Generally, you can't go beyond healthcare for that type of theory. So just be very clear about what the domain is of your explanation. If you move beyond that, you may need to alter the model's propositions or nullify them. And you can also use these contextual conditions as controls. If it's only in large organizations, well, then you can control for size of the organization. So the contextual assumptions can also be very useful in thinking about what kinds of controls you want to have. Now, there are really two ways to use context in building theory. So first of all, you can contextualize theory. So that would be theories used in context. And that's what we were just talking about, identifying the boundaries that within which the theory applies, the circumstances under which the propositions should be expected to hold. And it's a way of guarding against inappropriate applications, just like the owner's manual is a way of preventing you from doing something really unsafe with that saw. So it's a way of avoiding inappropriate applications of your model. So context, when you're doing theories in context, you may talk about which cultures it's limited to, or particular political and economic features that it's limited to. May also be different types of organizations. This is limited to not-for-profit organizations, for example, different types of groups, different types of individuals, or you may say this is an individual level theory. We don't intend for it to apply at the organizational level. So it's theories in context. You can also theorize about context. So these are theories of context, and sometimes these make really interesting papers. Really at the heart of comparative research. So if I'm doing research comparing some phenomenon in Brazil and the US, that's a theory of context. I'm looking at two different contexts and comparing my findings. So I'm using the contextual features to explain these observed differences, for example, in cultural values. And so there are some good theories of context. I use Hofstede a lot when I'm doing comparative research. More recently, I've started looking at the GLOBE study, which is kind of Hofstede's work on steroids. It goes to more dimensions and examines them in a much more thorough way. But those are, for doing contextual comparisons between different cultures, those are two good theories of context. And there are many others about different contexts. So putting this all together, what you would hope to end up with at the end on your piece of paper as you're drawing this out for your own use is at least two constructs. You're going to have an X construct and a Y construct, and maybe you'll have multiple X constructs. So independent variables. So those are the whats of the theory. The how and the why, that's the explanation, that's the relationships. And again, I would actually write right on there the reason that arrow is there. What does it mean? Why do I expect that X explains Y, or why do I expect that X leads to Y? So those are the explanations. And then that dashed line that goes around the whole thing, that's kind of the fence or the wall around the theory. And that's suggesting that it applies within certain contexts and from certain conceptual perspectives. So I would actually draw that dashed fence around the model, again, at least for your own use. Maybe you don't publish it that way. And then write on what conceptual assumptions am I coming from? What is my mindset in doing this? And then contextual assumptions. Where does this apply, to whom, and when? And if you come up with something like that, you're going to have a pretty good theory for guiding your research. So again, list the assumptions above and below the fence, the boundary that you have framing your model. Think about context. Which types of contexts might substantially change the propositions in your model, and how? So that's where you're thinking about the who, the when, and the where. And then conceptual assumptions is when you're thinking about which perspective. So it's important to pay special attention to conceptual assumptions when you're formulating or applying deductively generated propositions, and especially look at contextual assumptions when you're doing grounded theory development and looking at assumptions there. All right, so let's look at actually developing theory now that we are familiar with the building blocks. So common strategies for developing theory. One is starting with practice, moving from practice to theory. So you see this, you see this a lot in Harvard Business Review. I think a lot of interesting theories that we use in supply chain management and operations management. I go back to some of the original articles in Harvard Business Review that were written by consultants who are very familiar with what goes on in practice, and then they're able to compare what's going on in multiple organizations and then draw generalizations from them at a higher level. That's a really good foundation for building theory. So carefully examine practice-based data and move to theory. We're also seeing a lot more of this now with archival data, these huge archival data sets. And you don't think of that as giving rise to emerging propositions, but it's a great way to come up with propositions. You dig around in the data set, what looks interesting, what is the story that the data is telling? And that's coming directly from practice. If you can figure out what that story is, then develop it into a theory. What are the main characters in the story? What is the plot of the story? And a good basis for developing theory. The other commonly used strategy is starting with theory and taking theory and applying it to practice. And in that sense, theory development is continuous. You start out with a theory, you go through iterations of constructing a theory, applying it to practice, and then going back and modifying the theory based on what you found when you applied it to practice. So you're continually going through iterations and adjusting it. So I guess at least some of you know Fernando, he was handling things behind the scene, but he's just finishing up his dissertation. And this is what he's done with that, where he developed theory, went out and collected case studies and tried to apply his theory to the case studies, and then modified his theory based on what he observed in the cases. Modify isn't even the right word. It's more he enhanced his theory. So he found some of the richness to support what he had proposed in his theory, and also move beyond and say, here's particular situations where it applies. So that would be the theory to practice approach. So I've got a couple of I don't know, models, I guess, that I stole from other people, but I think these are good ways of looking at theory. So first of all, theory informs practice and should lead to improved action. Practice also informs theory. It helps you come up with knowledge, and then you develop a system for making that knowledge coherent, disciplined, and rigorous. Theory informs research. It should guide what you're doing in research. Research also informs theory because you're constantly modifying and enhancing your theory based on your empirical findings. Practice should inform research. That's where the best research questions come from. What's really important? Talk to some managers when you're teaching MBA classes for working professionals to say, what keeps you up at night? What are your concerns? So that's a really great way to come up with important research questions. And research, again, should also inform practice, leading to improved action. And here's the other one, looking at the types of things that we do in research. And the practice to theory approach then would be starting with a deductive approach and ending up with an inductive approach, building theory based on what you observed in your analysis. Theory to practice, starting out with inductive theory, testing it, and then leading to a deductive approach. So let me talk about these things in a more concrete fashion. So if you're using a practice to theory approach, you start out by selecting something that you're interested in, listing all its characteristics based on what you've observed in practice, and then try to measure those characteristics. So those are the constructs. Try to measure them in as many different situations as possible. I found something really unique in an organization where I was talking to somebody. I wonder if that phenomenon exists in other organizations as well. So by measure, I don't necessarily mean use numbers. You might just call some other managers and say, have you ever observed this in your organization? But see if that construct that you're thinking about exists in other contexts as well. Then analyze the resulting data for systematic patterns worthy of further attention. And again, when I say data, it could be qualitative data. It doesn't have to be numbers, but what did you learn from talking to these managers in different places? Is there something systematic going on that's interesting? And then you formalize those interesting patterns as theoretical statements with constructs and so boxes and arrows for relationships and the why. So what are those significant patterns? And then you would try to contextualize them and think about the conceptual boundaries as well. Theory to practice, start out with a theory that maybe you developed, or maybe you borrow from somebody else who developed a theory previously. Select one statement that's generated by it to compare with the results of your empirical research. So what about that theory seems like it might be important in the situation that you're studying? And then design a research project to test how well that statement corresponds with empirical findings. If it doesn't correspond, that isn't terrible. You know, I think we always have this mentality that we have to support all of our hypotheses. If you're starting out with good theory and it's not supported, I think that's a really interesting finding. So if it doesn't correspond, either change the theory. Maybe you found an interesting way that that theory should be modified, or it may be your research design. Maybe you're not measuring it appropriately, but think about both the theory and the research design, and then continue and you know, kind of iterate through that process. If it does correspond, well, then maybe you look at another more detailed statement for testing and use that to determine the theory's limitations. So both practice to theory and theory to practice are valid approaches of building theory and making a theoretical contribution. All right, let me wind up with just a few things. One is how are theories assessed? How do you know if you have a good theory? And you're not going to be good on all of these, but these are kind of high-level criteria for determining how good a theory is. First of all, is it complete? How comprehensive is it? Does it cover the area of interest and include all known data in a field? This doesn't happen until a theory's been around for many years. But if you look at some of the older theories that have been around for a long time, like agency theory, for example, it's been around for a long time. It's been tested again and again and again, and it's quite comprehensive because it's been used in so many different situations. Can it be operationalized? Is your theory precise enough that you can measure it? That's something you can look at right away when you're developing a theory initially, because you want theory to be a guide for research. And if you can't test it, it's not going to guide your research. So is it precise enough that you can operationalize it? Is it correct? That's important. Is it supported by experience or experiments? And again, sometimes that's just calling managers and talking to them and saying, does this ring true to you? This is what I think is going on, or this is kind of a model that I've put together. Have you observed this? That's a good start. And I would definitely report that in a paper. Farther on, have you tested it statistically? Does it seem like it's valid? So again, if you're generating new research, this is important. It needs to be right and verified. If you disconfirm it, again, that's interesting as well. So that can also stimulate developments of better theory. Is it important? You know, some of the theory that we have is just plain stupid. I think it's like, who cares? You know, so are you looking at something that's really important to the real world, people in the real world, to professionals? Again, talk to professionals. Ask them. We have plenty of opportunities to talk to managers. Ask them if this describes something that's important to them. Also, is it recognized by academics as being important? And there you can look at persistence in the literature. Was it a theory that was just kind of a flash in the pan and we never saw it again? Or is it something that's been around for a long time? I think Mark would disagree with me. I like using old theories that have been around for a long time. He likes new theories. I think both perspectives are good. But to me, if something's been around in the literature for a long time, it's that persistence. We believe this is an important theory. Is it still relevant to this situation? I think that's interesting. I think Mark would tell you something very different. Precision and clarity. Is it free of ambiguities? Is this theory understandable? You know, could you explain it to your mother so that she could understand it? If not, you need to make it simpler, because a lot of the people reading the paper may have no idea what you're talking about. If they can't understand your theory, then they're not going to like your article. So make sure you can explain it clearly. Is it internally consistent? I'm working with something with Wendy right now and some other people where we're trying to develop a theory, and Wendy keeps saying, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. She's coming in from the outside on something that has been developed already. And this is really important to have people like that are saying, this doesn't make sense. You can't explain it this way. You know, you guys are too close to this theory. I'm telling you, it doesn't make sense. So that's really important to have somebody who's not as close to it look at it and tell you, does it make sense or not? And that really helps you then make propositions once you've got something that's really unambiguous. Is it simple? This goes with making it understandable. To me, the best theory is the least complex one. Doesn't have a lot of assumptions. It can apply, it's very easy to see how it applies. Now, don't get carried away and make it so simple that it's silly. So it still has to be interesting, but try to make it as simple as possible for what you're explaining. And then fruitfulness. Does it lead to testable propositions? This is ultimately what we would like to do when we're developing theory is come up with a foundation for testable propositions that will guide everything we do in a paper. It should guide the method that we follow. It should guide the data that we collect, and it should also guide the propositions that we're going to test. And by developing testable propositions, that leads to the development of more new knowledge, which is our ultimate goal. Even if the predictions aren't supported, that still is interesting. That contributes to knowledge. It may also promote thinking and encourage people who are reading your theory to think, that kind of sounds like something I've thought about. And they may develop their own theories then based on something you said. Again, that's important. And sometimes it's because they said, no, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. I think this is how it's happening. So sometimes your theory may lead to disbelief or resistance. And that, again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. They're challenging it. They're thinking about things from their perspective. This gets to conceptual perspectives. So that can be important. And then is it practicality? Do practitioners, do managers find your theory interesting in organizing their thinking and practice? In business, we're in an applied realm, and if what we're doing is not useful to actual managers, then I think we're wasting our time. I don't think we should be doing this just to entertain each other. So is it useful to managers? All right, last slide. A few tips, kind of secrets, I guess, for using theory in writing an article. So first of all, in a theory testing article, make sure you're applying the right theory. Is the theory you are applying relevant to your research question? I get tired of reading articles where resource-based view seems to be the theory that explains everything. Resource-based view, it's a good theory, and it works well in certain situations, but it doesn't explain everything. So make sure you've got the right theory. Don't just jump on whatever the theory is that everybody else is using. Look for the right theory. And that comes with, I guess, maturity as a scholar. If some of you are young and new scholars, I think the more familiar you get with the literature, the more you understand different theories, and you've got these theories that you can draw upon. If you're just starting out, that's hard to do, but that's where working with somebody that is more experienced can help, because they can say, oh, wait a minute, I think this other theory might be the best one. Second, use theory to guide everything that you do in the paper. You're guaranteed to have a good paper if your theory guides everything you do. Your hypotheses should be directly related to the theory. The data that you collect should be related to the theory. How you collect it, how you analyze it. It should dictate everything you're doing. It ties back to what I said at the beginning about theory as being a roadmap to writing a good paper and designing a good study. Avoid simply inserting the obligatory theory paragraph on here's a theory and I'm not going to talk about it again in the rest of the paper. When you get to the discussion, sometimes it's hard to know what to do in the discussion. Not if you've got a theory. That's where you tie what you found back to the theory. That's where you can really get creative and say, here's what we found. This is really consistent with the theory, but gosh, we also found this other thing that our theory predicted, but it turned out it wasn't true. And here's why we think it wasn't true. And, our analysis also suggested that there might be some useful ways to expand this theory. So when you tie your discussion back to theory, it gives you all kinds of cool things you can do in your discussion and not just repeat what you already said in the results. Okay, for theory building research, it's important to focus on understanding the theory that is emerging, not on storytelling. Sometimes, again, especially young researchers will write case-based papers that are stories about what went on at a company, and those are really interesting. I like using them in class. They can bring a situation to life for my students, but it's not theory, it's a story. So you need to rise above that. Here's the story that we saw. It's fine to include the story. Here's what we saw, but here's what we think it means for higher level thinking. How does this come together in higher level knowledge? Sometimes it's easier when you have several cases that you're looking at. You look at the stories that several of them tell. Here's what they had in common. That's getting at building the theory. So the theory that's emergent. Make sure you start with the right empirical observations if you're building theory. Use it always to develop a foundation for future research. Again, that's a way to ensure that you're not just telling stories. What does this suggest researchers should do in the future? That kind of forces you to move up to that higher level. If you include propositions or at least questions to guide future research, that ties what you're doing in with theory rather than just telling stories. For people like me who are more deductive, I really think it helps a lot if you're doing qualitative research to follow structured qualitative research. It helps convince skeptical reviewers like me that you have actually found something and it's not just your opinion. So really get into method if you're doing qualitative research. Tell us what your method was. You have to convince me that if I went back and applied the same approach, I would come up with the same conclusions that you have. So you really need to convince your readers that it's applicable more broadly. And then finally, make sure you have a chain of evidence. That's part of this structured qualitative analysis. You say, here's the evidence that we found from all these different sources. Here's how they led to this proposition. Make sure you link all that together, link your thought process together to convince the readers that what you're finding truly exists, and we would find the same thing if we use the same approach, rather than just your opinion about what's happening. So I'm going to stop sharing here, and I don't know if we have time for questions or if this is your break time. So I'm not sure how the schedule is set up. So I either finished 5 minutes late or 10 minutes early. So do we have time for questions or
yes,
not?
Sure. Thanks
Okay,
for
all right.
the presentation. Very clear and useful, especially for PhD students and junior faculty. So we have 10 minutes. I will invite Tintin to comment some points of your presentation. The audience, if you have some questions, please share, post it in our chat, or raise your hand. You are very...
And I should also mention that I sent the slides to Fernando and he will distribute them to everybody. So
okay,
you can have them.
Yeah, thank you, Barb. This is great. Like I learned a lot because one of my first thing to do as an editor-in-chief is to decide whether the paper has theoretical contribution, which is really, it's not like a methodology, it's like a right or wrong. Like theoretical contribution is really something
hard, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard. Like so thank you. I learned a lot. So we do have a question from Susanna. So the question is more about the mid-range theories. So Susanna want to see whether you see there's more opportunity from a theoretical contribution perspective to develop mid-range theories in supply chain management.
Yeah. Hi, Susanna. Good to see you. She's my boss when I teach in Brazil.
Hi, Barb. Nice to see you too.
Yeah. So yeah, mid-range theory. So I kind of skipped over that because mid-range theory is something that I'm not the least bit comfortable with. But I would agree definitely with what she's saying. I think we've got tremendous opportunity for mid-range theory. I'll give you the story of a healthcare paper that I'm working on that has gone through many rounds of revision, and hopefully it's about to get published. I don't know, we'll see. But we started out with very high level theory. I thought it was a great paper. Submitted it to Decision Sciences, and they sent it out to a bunch of healthcare reviewers, and the healthcare reviewers absolutely hated it. They said, we don't care about this theory. Do you know anything about a hospital? We care about what other authors have done in a healthcare context. So we're like, oh, okay, all right, I guess we blew that, So then we went back and, I spent, I can't tell you how many months reading all kinds of healthcare research and books, and went back and wrote something that was very, very healthcare focused. To me, it wasn't theory. It was more positioning in the literature is what I would call it, but we did a really good job of positioning what we did in the healthcare literature. And the reviewers hated that too. And they said, well, there's no theory here. You've just positioned it in the literature. It's like, yeah, that's pretty much what I thought I had done. So it's, my impression of mid-range theory is it's specific to an area, but it's somewhere between positioning in the literature and high-level theory. It's theory that's developed just for healthcare. We see the same thing in logistics, in transportation. The people that do trucking research, they have their own way of looking at things. And I've learned this the painful way by trying to do some trucking research and getting totally shot down by the reviewers. So I think there's tremendous opportunity for mid-range theory development. I can't give you any advice on how to do it. I can only tell you how I've failed in my attempts, but I think there's a real need for it in just helping us understand what is the difference between positioning in the literature and actually having theory that generates testable propositions. So this is one of the things that we had talked about actually as the topic for one of these seminars at JSCM, and we finally decided, no, we're not going to do it because it's too hard to explain mid-range theory. So so this isn't a good answer. I think there's a huge opportunity for people who do it well, but I'm not one of those people, so I can't tell you how to do it.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Barb. Any other question from the participant? I do have a long list of questions in case you guys don't have, but, but I want to give other opportunities too, because this is really a challenge. Like I think for all of us, yeah. Any other comment, question from the participants? Okay, I guess I'll ask my question. Yeah, it's like one thing that I keep, I'm not sure it's right or wrong with doing it, but when I was looking at the paper and to assess, like particularly if I want to give a quick sense of whether this paper makes theoretical contribution, is I will ask myself, if I don't read the paper, do I know the proposition or the hypothesis that they are talking about, right? So it's kind of a sense check. Is there anything cognitively or like things that I don't know before I read the paper? But I want to see, Barb, how your view is in terms, because sometimes this will kind of put a little bit more preference to those who they start with the theory and then go back to the practice, because they usually will challenge the previous theory by, say, bringing in new construct or new relationship or challenge some assumption. But for those study who starting with a phenomena like a practice, and then they try to go back to theory, say, hey, this is an interesting problem, or this is a challenging like a decision, and then we use existing theory, which we already know, to explain it. Sometimes I feel like I'm not giving enough attention to those type of research. So what do you see kind of different?
Yeah, I mean, generally, most of what I've done, I start with a theory and try to apply it to practice. But I think both approaches are really. Sorry, I'm looking at the chat here as well. Hi, Marcelo, another old friend of mine who's chatting with me. Both approaches are important. I really like what you said about if you're using a theory well or developing a theory well, we should know what the hypotheses are before we even get to them, before we turn the page. Everything you do in the lit review should lead up to them, and then you turn the page. It's like, okay, that's exactly what I thought they were going to test.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a good tip and a good kind of hack for deciding whether a paper makes a contribution to theory or not. But certainly inductive research should do the same thing. If you're reading the thought process that the authors went through, you should be able to predict what the propositions are going to be.
Right.
And that's one of the things that bothers me sometimes. If I read a bunch of case studies and then there's these propositions that kind of just drop out of the sky, they haven't done a good job of convincing me. And I'm sure there's something that went on in their heads, but tell us what that is. Lead us through the steps so that it makes sense to us when you get to the propositions. I don't know if that's really answering your question, but that's what I would look at. Yeah.
Yes, that's great. So any other comment? I know we're running close to our time, and so just want to remind everyone to thank you for participating and then staying with us today for 4.5 hours. Wait, is that 4.5 hours? No, 3.5. My terrible math. But so we still have an exciting half day tomorrow. So just make sure if your time allows, we highly welcome you to come back. We'll have a meet the editor session, which will be in the breakout room, where you will have more interaction with some major journal editors. And then also we will have another 2 PDW. One is on the methods, right? So once you have a great idea, you have a theory, you figure out all the boxes, the arrows, then you need to do it. So Mark Pagal will talk about the method, and then we'll have Sriram talk about the introduction, which really, like, I think that's usually the section I keep to the last, like, because that's really the first impression for editor, for reviewer to decide, you might want to read it, right? So that's those first 3 pages or so. So we'll have a PDW on that, like how do you write the introduction? So if your time allows, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, let me pop in with one more suggestion. Well, when you're meeting with the editors tomorrow, it sounds like you're meeting with editors of various journals, ask them how they define making a theoretical contribution in their journal, because that does vary a lot by journals. I think that's a great question, and see what they say. See if they can articulate it, or if they go, oh, golly, that's a good question, you know. I think that's really important. And I definitely use the same approach Ting Ting does with the introduction. I see writing a paper, it's kind of, it's an emergent thing. It's almost like a living, breathing thing. And I don't really know where the paper's going until it's done.
Yes.
And I always do the introduction last, because I don't know what the paper's going to say before then. And if you feel like you have writer's block, I would always start out by writing the section that's the easiest for you to write. And for me, that's the method, because I know what I did. Just tell us what you did, you know? So I write a paper from the middle, and then I move out in both directions. And definitely the last thing I write is the introduction. So I would agree with you definitely there. So sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's a great suggestion. Yeah, so ask the editor what they think about the theoretical contribution and how should you write it. So basically everything we talked about today, like all the tips we receive in the morning. So yeah, so if your time allows, we would definitely want to see you back tomorrow. Ellie, do you want to have any other concluding comment for the audience?
No, just thanking for everybody, and see you tomorrow at the same time in the same channel.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Thank you, Barb. Thank you for the great talk.
Bye-bye, everybody.
We learned a lot.
Thanks,
Thank
Barbara.
you, everyone. Hope to see
Bye-bye.
you tomorrow.
Goodbye. See you
Bye,
tomorrow.
everyone.